The dust swirled around Ezra's worn leather boots as he guided his horse through the narrow streets of Redemption Creek. The town had earned its name from folks seeking second chances. But Ezra wondered if such a thing truly existed for someone like him. His weathered face bore scars that told stories he'd rather forget, and his left arm hung slightly crooked from an old injury that never healed right. People stared as he passed.
Oh.
Their eyes filled with the familiar mixture of fear and disgust he'd grown accustomed to over the years. Children pointed and whispered behind their mothers' skirts, while shopkeepers hurried their customers inside. Ezra had learned long ago not to take it personally. When you looked different, when your face didn't match what people expected, the world had a way of making you feel like an outsider. He stopped his horse outside Murphy's general store. It's the only place in town that would sell him supplies without making a scene. Old Murphy had lost his own leg in the war and understood what it meant to be seen as broken. Ezra tied his horse to the hitching post and walked inside, keeping his hat pulled low over his scarred face. "Afternoon, Murphy," Ezra said quietly, his voice rough from days of riding alone. "Ezra, good to see you, Murphy," replied warmly. "The usual supplies?" Before Ezra could answer, the bell above the door chimed, and a young woman entered. She had auburn hair that caught the afternoon light streaming through the window, and green eyes that seemed to hold more kindness than Ezra had seen in years. Her dress was simple but clean, and she carried herself with quiet dignity despite the worn edges of her clothing. "Afternoon, Mr. Murphy," she said with a gentle smile. "I'm looking for work. Any kind of honest work?" Murphy scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Well, Miss Clementine," she replied. Clementine rose. "Well, Miss Rose, work's been scarce lately. Most folks around here are barely getting by themselves." Ezra noticed how Clementine's shoulders sagged slightly at the news, though she tried to hide her disappointment. He also noticed how she hadn't even glanced in his direction, let alone recoiled in horror like most people did. It was as if she simply saw him as another person in the store. Nothing more, nothing less. "I can clean, cook, mend clothes," Clementine continued hopefully. "I worked at the hotel in Silver Springs before I had to leave." There was something in her voice that suggested leaving hadn't been her choice. Ezra recognized the tone of someone running from something, someone who understood what it meant to be unwelcome. I might know of something Ezra found himself saying before he could stop himself. Both Murphy and Clementine turned to look at him. He saw Clementine's eyes widen slightly as she took in his scars, but there was no fear there, only curiosity. "Cabin could use some tending," Ezra continued, his heart beating faster than it had in years. "It's about 5 miles north of town. It's nothing fancy, but it's honest work, and I can pay fair wages." Murphy raised his eyebrows in surprise. In all the years he'd known Ezra, the man had never shown interest in hiring help or having anyone around his isolated cabin. Clementine studied Ezra's face carefully, not looking away from his scars, but seeming to look past them to something else. "What kind of work exactly?" "Cooking, cleaning, maybe some mending like you mentioned. I'm not around much during the day, so you'd have the place mostly to yourself. There's a small room off the kitchen where you could stay." "Why?" Clementine asked directly. "You don't even know me." Ezra was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. "Because I know what it's like when people won't give you a chance," he said finally. "Because you didn't look at me like I was some kind of monster." Clementine's expression softened. "Maybe because I know monsters don't usually offer work to strangers?" Murphy cleared his throat. "Ezra's a good man, Miss Rose. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's never caused trouble for anyone." "When would you need me to start?" Clementine asked. "What, eh?" "If you're willing," Ezra replied. "I can take you out to the cabin now. Let you see if it suits you." Clementine nodded. "I'll need to collect my things from the boarding house." "I'll wait," Ezra said. As Clementine left to gather her belongings, Murphy approached Ezra. "You sure about this, son? You've been living alone out there for near on 3 years now." "Maybe it's time for a change," Ezra replied, though he wasn't entirely sure what had possessed him to make the offer. Something about Clementine's quiet strength, the way she hadn't flinched when she saw him, made him think that perhaps not everyone in the world was determined to judge him by his appearance. 20 minutes later, Clementine returned with a small carpet bag and a worn leather satchel. Ezra helped her up onto his horse, trying to ignore the way his pulse quickened when their hands briefly touched. It had been so long since he'd had any kind contact with another person that even this simple gesture felt significant. They rode in comfortable silence through the desert landscape, past towering red rocks and scattered scrub brush. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Ezra found himself stealing glances at his passenger, wondering what circumstances had brought her to Redemption Creek and whether she would stay when she learned more about him. "It's beautiful out here," Clementine said finally, breaking the silence. "Most people find it too lonely," Ezra replied. "Sometimes lonely is better than being somewhere you're not wanted," she said quietly. Ezra understood exactly what she meant. As they crested a small hill, his cabin came into view, a modest wooden structure with a stone chimney and a small corral where he kept his horses. It wasn't much, but it was home, and for the first time in years, he wouldn't be facing it alone. "It's not fancy," he said as they approached. "It looks like home," Clementine replied. And something in her voice made Ezra believe that maybe, just maybe, both of their lives were about to change in ways neither of them could imagine. Clementine woke before dawn on her third day at Ezra's cabin, the desert air cool and crisped against her face, and she had fallen into a comfortable routine quickly, rising early to prepare breakfast and tend to the small vegetable garden behind the house. Ezra was always gone by the time she woke, leaving only the faint scent of coffee and the sound of hoofbeats fading into the distance. She had learned not to ask where he went or what he did during his long absences. The few times she'd inquired, he'd grown quiet and changed the subject. But she noticed things, the way he sometimes returned with dust from different colored soil on his boots, the careful way he counted coins before placing them in a wooden box under his bed, and how he always seemed to know exactly when storms were coming. This morning felt different somehow. As Clementine prepared eggs and bacon over the wood stove, she heard voices approaching the cabin. Her heart quickened with nervousness. In her 3 days here, no one had visited, and she'd begun to think Ezra had no friends or acquaintances. Through the kitchen window, she saw 3 men on horseback talking with Ezra near the corral. Even from a distance, she could tell the conversation was tense. Ezra's posture was rigid, and his hand rested near the gun on his hip. The other men wore badges that caught the early morning sunlight. Sheriff Dalton dismounted and approached Ezra with deliberate steps. "We need to talk, Callahan." "About what?" Ezra's voice carried across the yard, calm but wary. "About the Henderson Ranch. Someone's been stealing cattle, and the trail leads this direction." Clementine's stomach tightened. Town about missing livestock and growing tensions between ranchers. She pressed closer to the window, straining to hear. "You accusing me of something, Dalton?" Ezra asked. "I'm asking if you've seen anything unusual. Riders passing through, maybe." "Someone using your land as a route." Deputy Barnes, a young man with nervous eyes, spoke up. "Maybe we should search the property, Sheriff, just to be thorough." Ezra's jaw tightened. "You've got a warrant for that?" "Don't need one if you've got nothing to hide," Barnes replied with more confidence than his shaking hands suggested. Clementine had heard enough. She stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron. "Gentlemen, breakfast is ready if you'd like to join us." All 4 men turned to stare at her. She saw surprise cross the sheriff's weathered features, while Deputy Barnes looked her up and down with obvious interest. "Ma'am," Sheriff Dalton touched his hat. "Didn't know Ezra had company." Clementine rose, she said, extending her hand. "I help Mr. Callahan with his household." The third man, Deputy Collins, snorted. "Household? Is that what they're calling it now?" Clementine felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could respond, Ezra stepped forward. "Watch your mouth, Collins." "Or what?" Collins challenged. "You'll add assaulting an officer to cattle rustling?" "There's been no cattle rustling here," Clementine said firmly. "Mr. Callahan is rarely on the property during daylight hours, and I've seen no unusual activity." Sheriff Dalton studied her carefully. Where exactly do you go during the day, Ezra? That's my business. Not if it involves stolen cattle. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Clementine noticed how Ezra's scarred face had gone pale, and she realized this wasn't just about missing livestock. These men were looking for any excuse to cause trouble for him. Sheriff, she said calmly, I've been here 3 days, and I can account for Mr. Callahan's whereabouts each evening. He's been home before sunset every day, and his horse shows no signs of the kind of hard riding it would take to move stolen. Cattle Deputy Barnes squinted at her. How do we know you're telling the truth? Maybe you're in on it. Because, Clementine said, meeting his gaze steadily, I have nothing to gain by lying, and everything to lose if I'm caught in one. Sheriff Dalton seemed to consider this. He was older than his deputies, and had the look of a man who'd learned to read people over the years. We're not here to cause trouble, Miss Rose, but cattle theft is a serious crime. Of course it is, she agreed. Which is why you should be looking for the real thieves instead of harassing honest people. Collins laughed harshly. Honest. Look. At him, you think a face like that comes from honest work? The words hung in the air like a gunshot. Clementine saw something die in Ezra's eyes, the same look she'd seen in her own mirror back in Silver Springs, when people whispered about her past. His face comes from serving his country, she said quietly, but with steel in her voice. Those are war wounds, Deputy Collins? Maybe you should show some respect for a man who fought for this land, while you were probably still learning to tie your boots. Ezra looked at her with surprise, and something that might have been gratitude. Sheriff. Dalton cleared his throat. That's enough. We'll be moving on, but we'll be keeping an eye on things. As the 3 lawmen mounted their horses, Collins couldn't resist one final jab. Interesting company you're keeping these days, Callahan. Hope she knows what she's gotten herself into. After they rode away, Ezra stood in the yard for a long time, staring at the dust clouds they'd left behind. Clementine approached him carefully. You didn't have to do that, he said finally. Yes, I did. You don't know anything about me, about what I've done, or where I've been? Clementine studied his profile, noting the way his shoulders carried invisible. Wait, I know you gave me work when no one else would. I know you treat your animals with kindness and never raise your voice. I know you leave money on Murphy's counter when you think he's not looking, for folks who can't afford their supplies. Ezra turned to face her. How do you know that? I have eyes, she said simply. I know what it looks like when someone's trying to make up for something real or imagined. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both understanding that something important had just happened between them. The wall Ezra had built around himself had developed its first crack, and Clementine had proven she was willing to stand beside him when the world tried to tear him down. Those cattle, Ezra said quietly. I haven't stolen anything, but I might know who has. Clementine nodded. Then maybe it's time to stop running from whatever's chasing you and start fighting back. As they walked back toward the cabin together, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the rocks above or the way he smiled before disappearing into the shadows. That evening, as thunder rumbled across the desert sky, Ezra finally told Clementine about his past. They sat on the cabin's small porch, watching lightning dance between the distant mountains, while rain drummed on the roof above them. I wasn't always like this, he began, touching the scars that ran along the left side of his face. Before the war, I was just another ranch hand with big dreams and bigger plans. Clementine waited patiently, sensing this was something he'd never shared with anyone. Had a woman back then, too, Rebecca Martinez. Beautiful as a sunrise, and twice as warm. We were going to be married when I got back from fighting. His voice grew distant. Funny how war changes everything. The rain intensified, creating a curtain of water around the porch. In the flickering light of the oil lamp, Ezra's scars seemed less prominent. And Clementine could see traces of the handsome young man he'd once been. What happened? She asked gently. Shrapnel from a cannon blast. Tore up my face. Broke my arm in 3 places. Spent months in a military hospital. And when I finally made it home, ... double quotes, his hands clenching into fists. Rebecca took one look at me and couldn't hide her horror. Said she was sorry, but she couldn't marry someone who would frighten children. Clementine felt anger burn in her chest, not at Ezra, but at a woman who could be so cruel to someone who'd sacrificed so much. That's when I came out here, Ezra continued. Figured if I looked like a monster, I might as well live like one. Alone away from people who'd rather not have to see me. But you're not a monster, Clementine said firmly. You're one of the kindest men I've ever known. Ezra looked at her with surprise. How can you say that? You barely know me. I know enough. She shifted in her chair to face him fully. I know you left extra firewood for Mrs. Chen when her husband was sick. No, you paid for little Tommy Morrison's medicine when his father couldn't afford it, Murphy told me. Murphy talks too much, Ezra muttered, but his expression had softened. I also know about the cattle thieves, Clementine said quietly. Ezra stiffened. What about them? You've been tracking them, haven't you? It's where you go every day. You're trying to find evidence to clear your name and catch the real thieves. For a long moment, the only sound was rain against the roof. Finally, Ezra nodded. There's a gang working out of the old Sinclair mine, about 15 miles east, led by a man named Pike Jackson. They've been stealing cattle from ranchers all over the territory and selling them across the border. Why haven't you gone to the... Sheriff Ezra's laugh was bitter. You saw how Dalton and his men treated me today. Who do you think they'd believe? A scarred hermit or a well-dressed cattle baron who's been buying stolen stock? Cattle baron? Jackson's got connections. Money? He's been paying off the right people to look the other way while he builds his operation. Ezra stood and began, pacing. I've been watching them for weeks, learning their patterns, gathering information. But I'm just one man, and they've got an army? Lightning illuminated the desert, and in that brief moment, Clementine saw something in Ezra's eyes she hadn't noticed before. Fear, not of the thieves, but of what would happen if he couldn't prove his innocence. What if we could get help? She asked. Who would help someone like me? Clementine stood and moved to stand in front of him, forcing him to meet her eyes. You keep saying someone like me as if you're something terrible. See a man who's been hurt by the world and still chooses to help others? I see someone who's been rejected and abandoned, but still has enough faith in people to offer work to a stranger. Clementine, ... I'm not finished. Her voice was soft but determined. I see a man who deserves better than what life has given. Him, and I see someone worth fighting for. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Ezra searched her face, looking for signs of deception or pity, but found only sincerity. Why? He asked finally. Why do you care what happens to me? Clementine hesitated, then decided on honesty. Because in Silver Springs, I was the one people whispered about. I was the school teacher who made the mistake of falling in love with a married man. When his wife found out, she made sure everyone in town knew. I lost my job, my reputation, my home. I know what it feels like to be judged for something that doesn't define who you really are, understanding passed between them, like an electric current. They were both refugees from a world that had decided they weren't worthy of second chances. So what do we do? Ezra asked. We fight back, Clementine said. Together the next morning dawned clear and bright. Clementine had spent the night forming a plan, and she presented it to Ezra over breakfast. We can't go to Sheriff Dalton, but what about the territorial marshal? He'd have authority over local law enforcement. Marshal Wade is based in Santa Fe. It would take days to reach him, and by then Jackson's gang could disappear. What if we could get word to him? Send someone. He'd trust? Ezra considered this. Maybe, but who, Murphy? He served with Marshal Wade during the Apache Wars. They're old friends. That could work, Ezra admitted, but we'd still need solid proof. Testimony from a scarred hermit won't be enough. Then we get proof, Clementine said simply. Tonight, absolutely not. Ezra's voice was firm. It's too dangerous. These men are killers, and they'll keep killing and stealing until someone stops them. Clementine met his gaze steadily. I'm not asking your permission, Ezra. I'm telling you what I'm going to do. The only question is whether you'll help me or if I'll have to do it alone. Ezra stared at her for a long moment, seeing the same determination in her eyes that had allowed her to defend him against the deputies. He realized that Clementine Rose was perhaps the strongest person he'd ever met. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel quite so alone. "All right," he said finally. "But we do this my way, carefully, quietly. And if things go wrong, you run, we both run," she corrected. "Agreed." Ezra reached across the table and took her hand. "Thank you. For what?" "For seeing me as someone worth saving." As their fingers intertwined, both of them knew they were crossing a line from which there would be no return. Whatever happened at the Sinclair mine that night would change everything. The moon was barely a sliver in the star-filled sky as Ezra and Clementine approached the abandoned Sinclair mine. They'd left their horses tied in a grove of cottonwoods half a mile back and covered the rest of the distance on foot, moving carefully. Across the rocky terrain, Ezra had spent weeks studying the gang's routine. Pike Jackson's men usually arrived around midnight with stolen cattle, holding them in the natural corral formed by the mine's rocky walls until they could be moved south to buyers in Mexico. Tonight, if Ezra's calculations were correct, they'd be moving a herd of Henderson's prize-breeding stock. "Stay low," Ezra whispered, as they crested a ridge overlooking the mine. "And remember, if things go bad, you head straight back to the horses." Clementine nodded, though she had no intention of leaving him behind if trouble started. She'd brought her father's old pistol, hidden beneath her jacket, and while she'd never shot a man, she was a decent shot with bottles and tin cans. Below them, the abandoned mine spread out like a black wound in the earth. The main shaft was boarded up, but the surrounding buildings showed signs of recent use. Lantern light flickered from what had once been the foreman's office. They could hear voices carrying on the still night air. There, Ezra pointed to a makeshift corral where shadows moved in the darkness. At least 50 head of cattle, more than Henderson reported missing. As they watched, riders began emerging from the desert, driving more cattle toward the mine. Even in the dim light, Clementine could make out the Henderson brand on several of the animals. "We need to get closer," Ezra murmured. "Close enough to identify Jackson and get an accurate count of the stolen livestock." They began working their way down the rocky slope, using boulders and scrub brush for cover. The voices became clearer as they approached, and Clementine's heart pounded as she realized they were overhearing the thieves planning their next raids. "Morrison's got a nice herd up north," one man was saying. "Easy pickings, and the old man's half blind anyway." "What about that hermit's place?" another voice asked. "Callahan's got some good horses." Pike Jackson's voice was distinctive, smooth, and educated in a way that made his criminality seem even worse. "Leave Callahan alone for now. He's useful as a distraction. Let the law keep suspecting him while we finish our business here." Ezra's jaw tightened at the casual way they discussed framing him, but Clementine placed a steadying hand on his arm. They needed to stay focused on gathering evidence. "Boss," a new voice called out. "Got a problem?" Jackson emerged from the office. Building, a tall man wearing an expensive hat and coat that seemed out of place in the rough mining camp. "What kind of problem, Stevens?" "Someone's been watching us. Found tracks on the North Ridge, fresh ones." Clementine's blood turned to ice. They had been so careful to avoid leaving obvious signs of their presence, but apparently not careful enough. "How many?" Jackson asked, his voice sharp. "Hard to say. Maybe 2 people, one of them riding a small horse or mule. This could be that schoolteacher." "Staying with Callahan?" suggested the man who'd spoken about Morrison's cattle. "Dalton mentioned her when he was here yesterday." Clementine felt Ezra tense beside her. Sheriff Dalton had been here? Her mind raced with the implications. "Interesting," Jackson mused. "Apps, our scarred friend is more resourceful than we gave him credit for. Stevens, take Martinez and Collins. Find them. What if it's not them? Either find out who it is and make sure they don't report back to anyone." The casual way Jackson ordered what amounted to murder made Clementine's stomach turn. These men weren't just thieves. They were killers who saw human life as expendable. 3 riders mounted their horses and began, heading in different directions, clearly intending to surround and trap whoever might be watching. Ezra grabbed Clementine's arm and began pulling her back up the slope. "We have to go now." They moved as quickly as they dared across the rocky terrain, but Clementine could hear hoofbeats getting closer. Her breath came in short gasps, as she struggled to keep up with Ezra's longer strides. "This way," Ezra whispered, pulling her toward a cluster of large boulders. "We can hide until they pass." They pressed themselves against the cold stone, trying to control their breathing. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, and Clementine could hear the riders calling to each other. "Check behind those rocks, Martinez." "Nothing here, Stevens." They couldn't have gone far on foot. The voices were close now, maybe 20 yards away. Clementine felt Ezra's hand find hers in the darkness, and she squeezed it tight. Trying to draw strength from his presence, a horse whinnied nearby, and then Stevens' voice rang out. "Found their mounts." "Cottonwood Grove, just like you said, Martinez." Clementine's heart sank. Without their horses, they were trapped. "Burn the saddles," Stevens ordered, "and scatter the horses. Let's see how far they get on foot." Minutes later, they heard gunshots and saw orange flames licking at the sky where their horses had been tethered. Ezra closed his eyes in frustration. It would be a long, dangerous walk back to the cabin, assuming they could avoid Jackson's men. "Now what?" Clementine whispered. "Now we wait," Ezra replied grimly, "and pray they give up looking before dawn." They spent the next 3 hours huddled behind the rocks, listening to Jackson's men search the area around the mine. Twice, riders passed close enough that Clementine could have reached out and touched their horses. But somehow they remained undetected. As the eastern sky began to show the first hints of dawn, the search finally ended. They heard Jackson calling his men back to finish loading the cattle for transport south. "This isn't over," Jackson's voice carried clearly in the still air. "Postguards on the main roads. If Callahan or his woman try to reach town, I want to know about it." When the last of the cattle thieves had disappeared into the desert, Ezra and Clementine emerged from their hiding place. The sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, but neither of them felt much like appreciating the beauty. "We have what we came for," Clementine said, trying to sound optimistic. "We saw them with the stolen cattle, heard them, planning more raids. We know Sheriff Dalton is working with them," Ezra added grimly. "That explains why he was so quick to suspect me. How do we get word to Marshal Wade now?" "Jackson's men will be watching the roads." Ezra was quiet for a moment, thinking, there might be a way. But it means trusting someone I'm not sure we can trust. "Who?" "Deputy Collins. He's young, ambitious, and I don't think he's part of Jackson's operation." When Dalton brought him here yesterday, Collins seemed genuinely surprised by some of what he saw. "It's a big risk." "Everything's a risk now," Ezra replied. "But if we don't try, Jackson will keep stealing and killing, and I'll keep taking the blame." As they began the long walk back to Wardtown, staying off the main roads and using rocky terrain to hide their tracks, both of them understood that they'd crossed a point of no return. They'd seen too much, knew too much. Jackson wouldn't stop hunting them until they were silenced permanently, but they'd also found something worth fighting for. Something that made the risk worthwhile. They'd found each other, and neither of them was willing to let the other face the coming storm alone. By the time Ezra and Clementine reached the outskirts of Redemption Creek, the sun was high overhead and their feet were blistered from hours of walking across rough terrain. They'd managed to avoid Jackson's men by following creek beds and animal trails, but the detour had added miles to their journey. There, Clementine pointed toward Murphy's general store, where a lone figure sat on the front porch. "Is that Deputy Collins?" Ezra squinted against the bright sunlight. The young deputy was alone, whittling a piece of wood with his knife, looking more like a bored farmhand than a law enforcement officer. "Looks like it. But we need to be careful. This could be a trap." They approached cautiously, using the storage shed behind Murphy's store for cover. From there, they could see that Collins was indeed alone, and he kept glancing nervously up and down the street as if waiting for someone. "He looks worried," Clementine observed. "Or guilty," Ezra replied, but something in the deputy's posture suggested fear rather than complicity. Taking a calculated risk, Ezra stepped out from behind the shed. "Collins." The deputy jumped to his feet, his hand moving instinctively to his gun. When he saw Ezra, his expression shifted from alarm to something like relief. "Callahan, where have you been?" Sheriff Dalton's been looking for you all morning. I'll bet he has, Ezra said dryly, noting how Colin's eyes darted nervously around the empty street. Question is, are you here to arrest me or to help me? Collins looked genuinely confused. Help you with what? Clementine emerged from their hiding place. Colin's eyes widened as he took in their disheveled appearance and the exhaustion written on their faces. We need to talk, Ezra said quietly. Somewhere private. Collins hesitated, then nodded toward the alley between Murphy's store and the barber shop. Back there, but make it quick. Dalton expects me back within the hour. Once they were hidden from view of the main street, Ezra got straight to the point. What do you know about Pike Jackson? Jackson? Collins frowned. He's a cattle buyer from El Paso. Bought some stock from the Henderson place last week. Why? Because he's the one who's been stealing cattle, not me, Ezra said. And I think Sheriff Dalton knows it. Collins laughed nervously. That's crazy. Talk Jackson's a legitimate businessman. Then why did Dalton visit Jackson's operation at the old Sinclair mine yesterday? Clementine asked quietly. Why are Jackson's men guarding the roads to keep us from reaching town? The color drained from Colin's young face. You're serious? Dead serious, Ezra replied. We spent last night watching Jackson's gang process. Stolen cattle. Henderson's prize breeding stock, Morrison's steers, probably half the missing livestock in the territory. But Sheriff Dalton said. Collins trailed off, his expression growing troubled. What did he say? Clementine pressed. Said Jackson was helping us track down the real thieves. Said Jackson had connections in Mexico who could help recover stolen cattle. Collins ran a hand through his hair. But some things never made sense. Like how Dalton always seemed to know where we wouldn't find evidence against you, Ezra saw. The moment when understanding dawned in the young deputy's eyes. Collins had been an unwitting pawn in Dalton's game, kept in the dark about the sheriff's true allegiances. How long has this been going on? Collins asked. Months, probably, Ezra replied. Long enough for Jackson to establish a solid operation, and for Dalton to deflect suspicion onto convenient scapegoats. Like you? Like me? Collins was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. If you're right about this, then I've been helping criminals. Good people have lost their livelihoods while I was chasing the wrong man. You didn't know? Clementine said gently. But now you do. The question is, what are you going to do about it? I need proof, Collins said finally. Something more than your word against the sheriffs. We have proof, Ezra replied. We saw the cattle, heard Jackson planning future raids. But we need to get word to Marshal Wade in Santa Fe. Dalton's already sent word to Wade, Collins said. I told him you were the prime suspect and that he expected to make an arrest soon. Ezra cursed under his breath. If Wade believed Dalton's version of events, the marshal might not listen to contradictory evidence from the accused. There's something else, Collins continued reluctantly. Dalton's organizing a posse for this afternoon. Says he's got reliable information about where you're hiding stolen cattle. Let me guess, Clementine said grimly. At Ezra's cabin? Collins nodded. He's planning to plant evidence there. Make it look like you've been using your place as a staging area. Ezra felt a cold fury building in his chest. Not only were they trying to frame him, but they were going to destroy the one place where he'd found peace and happiness. When? He asked. 3 o'clock. He wants to catch you both there. Clementine grabbed Ezra's arm. We can't go back to the cabin. It's exactly what they're expecting. But if we don't, they'll plant their evidence, and we'll have no way to prove our innocence, Ezra replied. It'll be our word against physical proof, not if we get there first, Collins said quietly. Both Ezra and Clementine turned to stare. At him, I could warn you when they're coming. Give you time to document what really happens. Why would you help us? Ezra asked suspiciously. Collins straightened his shoulders, looking older than his years. Because I became a lawman to protect innocent people, not to help criminals destroy them. If Sheriff Dalton is corrupt, then it's my duty to stop him. Could cost you your job, Clementine warned. Maybe worse. Some things are more important than a job. Collins replied with quiet conviction. Ezra studied the young deputy's face, seeing genuine resolve there. All right, but this has to look natural, You can't give them any reason to suspect you're helping us. What do you need me to do? Ride back to town? Act normal? When Dalton gets ready to leave for my cabin, you volunteer to scout ahead. That'll give you an excuse to reach us first, and then we spring a trap of our own, Ezra said grimly. An hour later, Ezra and Clementine were hidden in the rocks above his cabin, watching as Deputy Collins rode into the yard below. The young lawman dismounted and began examining the area around the corral, playing his part perfectly. Ezra, he called out loudly, I know you're here. Sheriff Dalton sent me to bring you in. When no answer came, Collins began searching the cabin, emerging a few minutes later with a frustrated expression. He remounted his horse and rode back toward town, but not before making a subtle gesture toward the rocks where Ezra and Clementine were hidden. He's good, Clementine murmured. Natural actor. Let's hope he's good enough to fool Dalton, Ezra replied. They didn't have long to wait. Within an hour, dust clouds appeared on the horizon, and soon Sheriff Dalton rode into view, leading a posse of 6 men. Ezra recognized several of them as Jackson's gang members, now masquerading as concerned citizens helping law enforcement. Spread out, Dalton called. Search everywhere. We're looking for evidence of cattle theft. What followed was a carefully orchestrated performance. The posse members discovered hidden branding irons, forged bills of sale, and other evidence. That had obviously been planted in advance. Dalton made a show of documenting each find while expressing disappointment in Ezra's apparent criminality. It's all here, one of Jackson's men announced, holding up a leather pouch. Bills of sale for Henderson's cattle, dated last week. Excellent work, boys, Dalton said with satisfaction. Should be enough to hang Callahan and his accomplice. From their hiding place, Ezra and Clementine watched as their lives were systematically destroyed by lies and planted evidence. But they also documented every moment, noting which men handled which pieces of evidence and how certain Dalton seemed about where to look for incriminating materials. We need to get this information to Marshal Wade, Clementine whispered. But how Collins? Ezra replied. He's our only chance. As the posse prepared to leave, Deputy Collins approached Sheriff Dalton. Should I stay behind and watch for Callahan's return? Good thinking, Deputy. But don't try to take him alone. Fire 3 shots if you see him, and we'll come running. After the main group rode away, Collins waited a careful 10 minutes before, making his way up into the rocks where Ezra and Clementine were hidden. Did you see enough? He asked grimly. More than enough, Ezra replied. But seeing isn't the same as proving. We need to get word to Marshal Wade before Dalton's version of events becomes accepted truth. I can ride to Santa Fe, Collins offered. Tell Wade what really happened. Dalton will wonder where you went, Clementine pointed out, and if Jackson's men are watching the roads, ... Then we need a different approach, Ezra said thoughtfully. Something that forces the truth into the open where everyone can see it. As the sun began to set behind the desert mountains, the 3 unlikely allies began planning what would either clear Ezra's name or get them all killed in the attempt. The plan they devised was dangerous and required perfect timing, but it was their only chance to expose the truth before Dalton's web of lies became unbreakable. The annual Founders' Day celebration in Redemption Creek was 3 days away, and the entire territory would be represented, including Marshal Wade, who traditionally attended to renew old friendships and address any territorial concerns. Jackson won't be able to resist, Collins explained as they finalized their strategy. Dalton's promised him that you'll be arrested publicly during the celebration. It's supposed to be the grand finale that proves the sheriff's competence and Jackson's innocence, and that's when we strike, Ezra said grimly. In front of everyone, where the truth can't be buried or twisted. The next 3 days passed slowly. Ezra and Clementine remained hidden in an old prospector's cabin Collins had found in the hills. While the deputy maintained his normal routine in town, each evening he brought them updates on the preparations for their supposed capture. Dalton's got everything arranged, Collins reported on the second night. Jackson's bringing his whole gang to town, supposedly to help with the arrest. They're planning to find you in the crowd and make a big show of taking you into custody. What? About the real evidence from the mine? Clementine asked. Still there, as far as I can tell? Jackson's been moving cattle through almost every night, getting bold now that he thinks his problems are about to be solved. On the morning of Founders Day, Redemption Creek buzzed with activity. Merchants set up booths in the main street. Families arrived from surrounding ranches, and a small platform was erected for speeches and official announcements. Marshall Wade arrived on the noon stage, distinguished man in his 50s whose reputation for honesty was known throughout the territory. Ezra and Clementine watched from the hills as the town filled with people. It was strange to see so much life and celebration in a place that had shown them mostly suspicion and hostility. Having second thoughts? Clementine asked, noting the tension in Ezra's jaw. About the plan? No. About putting you in danger? Every minute. She took his scarred hand in both of hers. Whatever happens today, I want you to know something. These past weeks with you have been the happiest of my life. You gave me a home when I had nowhere to go, and more than that, you gave me hope. Met her eyes, seeing his own feelings reflected there. I love you, Clementine rose. I never thought I'd be able to say those words to anyone. And I love you, Ezra Callahan. Scars and all. Especially the scars, because they're part of what makes you the man you are. Their kiss was interrupted by Colin's arrival, riding hard up the hill. It's time, he called out. Jackson's here with his men, and Dalton's getting ready to make his big announcement. The three of them rode toward town, splitting up as they reached the outskirts. Collins would resume his official duties, while Ezra and Clementine positioned themselves for the confrontation to come at exactly 2 o'clock. Sheriff Dalton stepped onto the platform and called for attention. Ladies and gentlemen, I have an important announcement to make regarding the recent cattle thefts that have plagued our territory. The crowd quieted, eager to hear news of the crimes that had affected so many of their neighbors. After weeks of investigation, I'm pleased to report that we've identified the culprit, Dalton continued with practiced authority. The evidence clearly points to Ezra Callahan, who has been using his isolated cabin as a staging area for stolen livestock. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some people nodded as if this confirmed their suspicions, while others looked troubled by the news. Furthermore, Dalton announced, I have reliable information that Callahan is here today, hiding among you. Good people. Call upon him to surrender himself for the safety of everyone present. That was Ezra's cue. He stepped out from behind Murphy's store, his hands visible but not raised. I'm right here, Dalton. The crowd gasped and began backing away. Creating a circle around Ezra, Marshall Wade stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun. Ezra Callahan, Dalton called out, you're under arrest for cattle theft conspiracy, and I'm here to prove my innocence, Ezra interrupted loudly, his voice carrying across the square. In front of all these witnesses, so the truth can't be buried. The evidence against you is overwhelming, Dalton replied. But Ezra noticed a flicker of uncertainty in the sheriff's eyes. What evidence? The bills of sale you planted in my cabin? The branding irons your men put in my barn? Ezra's voice grew stronger with each word. Or maybe you mean the cattle I supposedly stole, which are actually being held at the old Sinclair mine by Pike Jackson's gang. Pike Jackson stepped out from the crowd, his expensive suit and confident demeanor making him appear every inch the respectable businessman. Marshall Wade. This man is obviously desperate. He's trying to implicate innocent people to save his own neck. Innocent. Clementine emerged from her position near the hotel, holding a leather portfolio. Then perhaps you can explain these, Mr. Jackson. She opened the portfolio and held up photographs Collins had helped her take at the mine. Pictures of you and your men processing stolen cattle. Cattle-bearing brands from ranches all across the territory. Marshall Wade extended his hand. Let me see those. As Wade examined the photographs, Jackson's composure began to crack. Those could be doctored, Marshall. Can't trust the word of outlaws and their accomplices. What about the word of a deputy sheriff? Collins stepped forward, removing his badge and placing it on the platform. I've seen Sheriff Dalton meeting with Jackson's men. I've watched evidence being planted. I've been part of a conspiracy too. Frame an innocent man, and I can't be part of it anymore. The crowd erupted in shocked conversations. Marshall Wade raised his hand for silence. These are serious accusations, Wade said gravely. Sheriff Dalton, how do you respond? Dalton's face had gone pale, but he tried to maintain his authority. Marshal, you've known me for years. Are you going to believe the word of a scarred hermit and a disgraced schoolteacher over a sworn law enforcement officer? I'm going to believe the evidence, Wade replied firmly. He turned to address the crowd. I want everyone to remain calm. While we sort this out, Mr. Jackson, I'll need to examine your operation at the Sinclair mine. Of course, Marshal Jackson replied smoothly, but his eyes were scanning the crowd, looking for escape routes. That's when everything went wrong. One of Jackson's men, nervous about the turn of events, drew his gun and fired at Ezra. The shot went wide, but it triggered chaos in the crowded square. People screamed and ran for cover as Jackson's gang revealed their true nature, drawing weapons and firing wildly. Ezra tackled Clementine to the ground behind a water trough as bullets whined overhead. Stay down, he shouted over the gunfire. Marshal Wade and Deputy Collins had taken cover behind the platform and were returning fire, but they were outnumbered. Several innocent bystanders had been wounded in the initial volley, and more would die if the gunfight continued. Ezra made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. Instead of hiding, instead of running, he stood up in the middle of the chaos and called out in a voice that somehow carried over the gunfire. Jackson, this is between us. Let's settle it like men, not hide behind innocent people. The shooting gradually stopped as everyone turned to stare at the scarred man standing alone in the middle of the square. Jackson emerged from his cover, his gun drawn but pointed down. You're right, Callahan. This has gone on long enough. The two men faced each other across 30 yards of dusty streets surrounded by silent witnesses. It was like something from the old days when disputes were settled by courage and speed rather than politics and corruption. Any last words? Jackson asked, raising his gun. Yeah, Ezra replied, his own weapon appearing in his hand with surprising speed. They hurt you for being different, not anymore. Both men fired simultaneously. Jackson's shot went high, thrown off by the shock of Ezra's unexpected speed and accuracy. Ezra's bullet found its mark. Pike Jackson crumpled to the ground. The remaining gang members, seeing their leader fall and facing the determined resistance of Marshal Wade and the townspeople, threw down their weapons and surrendered. As the dust settled and the wounded were tended to, Sheriff Dalton was taken into custody, his corruption finally exposed. Marshal Wade formally cleared Ezra of all charges and commended Collins for his courage in standing up for justice, but for Ezra, the most important moment came when Clementine ran to him through the dispersing crowd and threw her arms around him. For the first time in years, he didn't try to hide his scars or apologize for his appearance. Instead, he held her close and kissed her in front of the entire town. He was no longer ashamed of who he was or afraid of who might be watching. 6 months later, Frey and Clementine were married in a simple ceremony at their rebuilt cabin with Deputy Collins serving as best man and Murphy giving away the bride. The town of Redemption Creek had indeed proven to be a place where people could find second chances. And both of them had found something even more precious than redemption. They had found love, acceptance, and the courage to stand up for what was right, no matter what the world thought of their scars.